We need to move on to the main story of the day, which is that, so speaking really of failing to plan, which is the topic of today's broadcast, it would seem, let's turn our attention to the COVID inquiry, where the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, was giving evidence yesterday. He's used to being on telly now, isn't he? He announced that he was profoundly sorry, and it was greeted with about as much sympathy as if he'd been apologising for failing to win a trial in the I'm a Celebrity jungle. Here's a clip of it.
Because of these, this huge error in the doctrine that the UK, and by the way, the whole Western world had in how to tackle a pandemic, and that flawed doctrine underpinned many of the problems that made it extremely difficult to respond. And if I may say so, I am profoundly sorry for the impact that had. I'm profoundly sorry for each death that has occurred. And I also understand why, for some, it will be hard to take that apology from me.
Now, John, I can remember around the time of various leaked WhatsApp messages, there was stuff in there advising Matt about how to appear on air at those press conferences he gave during COVID, how to appear more sympathetic. His now girlfriend, Gina Coladangelo, was behind a lot of that advice and making him look good. Do you think that is partly why that the relatives of the COVID dead that he was apologising to yesterday turned their backs on him and really didn't care?
Yeah, I think that it was a good thing that he did say sorry. I think that everyone has got to accept that. But you can see why people who lost lives in the pandemic didn't really want to hear that from him, and that it's very difficult, especially when it is Matt Hancock who comes across as, or he likes to think he comes across as, a smooth operator a lot of the time. And I don't want to be unfair, but sometimes you feel that some of the things that he says feel slightly rehearsed, maybe not totally natural. And so I think that it is perhaps not surprising that that didn't go down particularly well with a lot of families when it was delivered yesterday.
Yeah, I think your dog agrees as well, John. Either that or the postman's outside. So, we had all this situation, a bit of a rigmarole when he was at the inquiry. The relatives turned their backs on him. They heckled him. One even came dressed as the Grim Reaper. No one feels particularly sorry for Matt Hancock on that aspect, I suppose. But do you, dear viewer, do you think his apology was sincere? Do you think that it matters that he made it, even if people didn't necessarily take it at the time? Deborah says sorry is not going to bring people back. Quite right. So what did he say then while he was there? Well, he revealed, as he said briefly in that clip, that the problem with pandemic preparedness was doctrine, that the planners had basically just decided in advance that we were all doomed. And so they planned for body bags, but not PPE, which is perhaps why people who needed PPE suddenly started wearing body bags. So they didn't really think about how to get through it. They just thought that we were all doomed. Now, he blamed all this on how the process was planned and everything else. Now, remind me, John, who was the guy with responsibility for planning for this?
Yeah, well, at one point yesterday, when they were talking about care homes, and we know how bad things were with care homes, that we know the government said they threw a protective ring around care homes, but actually the reality didn't really show that. There was one point where Matt Hancock was saying that the preparations in the social care sector were terrible. And the barrister who was questioning him on behalf of the COVID inquiry actually said to him, well, what was your title at the time of the start of the pandemic? And Matt Hancock had to admit that his title was Health and Social Care Secretary. And he did kind of try and push the blame, saying that a lot of the preparations, they're actually the fault of local authorities. They were responsible and shouldn't have been doing this. But, Matt Hancock was there in the Department of Health and Social Care when there were these problems coming down the line. And it doesn't seem like in the run-up to pandemic, he did much to change them.
No, and the problem with the social care service, of course, is that although we've got a Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, he's not in charge of the social care because that's all run by private companies who have, regulators and profit motives and other things going on. And they go and buy their own kit and equipment and stuff. They don't have a big tied up kind of organization to do anything. Now, he said that he threw a protective ring around those care homes, as you said. He later blamed the care home staff for infecting their own patients. And at the inquiry, he admitted he didn't even know how many care homes there were, which, as the Secretary of State for the care homes, is astonishing. And because they weren't all tied up, there's no overall planning, they wouldn't know how they would operate and so on. Is it me, or is that just a really big argument was he making effectively an argument for a nationalised care service?
Well, I just think it seems quite slippery to go there and say you're profoundly sorry, point out all the problems, and then say, well, but hands up, it was nothing to do with me, that was totally someone else, and point the finger over there. Then I think that is quite problematic. And obviously, the whole point of this inquiry is to learn lessons. We know in the first module, looking at the preparations for the pandemic, were there things that we could have done slightly different in the months and years leading up to coronavirus that would have prepared us better? So building up those stocks of PPE, making sure that we had plans in place for the possibility of a lockdown. Matt Hancock said that's something that they'd never really looked at before. So, yeah, I think there's quite a lot of criticism of Matt Hancock, but we do need to learn lessons from it so that if there is another pandemic in the next few years, that we don't make these mistakes all over again.
Well, that would be ideal, wouldn't it? That is the purpose behind it. But what do you think, everybody? Are we going to be able to learn those lessons if the people who give evidence at the COVID inquiry are busy blaming everybody else? If they're not in there actually sort of saying anything we can put our faith in, who's going to learn anything? Dee says saying sorry and taking action and responsibility are two completely different things. They're all responsible. They all should be investigated and should all be held responsible for what they're doing. I suppose they've got to come to the inquiry and sort of be held to account in that way. But that's all they're ever going to face on this, isn't it, John? Unless the inquiry comes back in several years' time and pins it all on Matt Hancock somehow, he's never going to have anything more than questions to answer.
No, I think that's quite unlikely. I think that at each stage of this, you're likely to see different politicians appear. So there's going to be a whole chapter on the care homes when I think there will be a lot more questions about that issue of that protective ring that they claim to have thrown around the care homes. It didn't prove to be the point. There's going to be a whole section on vaccines, a whole section on general government decision making. And so, yeah, I don't think this is the last we're going to hear from Matt Hancock at the COVID inquiry. I think we're going to hear a lot more from him. But I think it's unlikely that the COVID inquiry, when it comes to its kind of final report, will pin the blame on individuals. I think it would be much more likely that it's about the government as a whole and coming up with ways that we can do things differently in the future.
Yeah, well, I look forward to some more Matt Hancock. Thanks, John. Speaking of which, though, and it's interesting that you mentioned there about the way the funding was operating and the PPE, stockpiles and so on, because, there is one point here which kind of Matt Hancock has kind of gone against, I suppose, Tory doctrine in a way. So in his appearance, he said that George Osborne, when he was at the inquiry, said austerity made the NHS more resilient and better able to cope with pandemic pressures because it wasn't wasting money on silly things like stockpiles of PPE. And if you believe that, and then, crumbling school buildings just make children want to learn quicker so they can get out. But Hancock said that the NHS just doesn't have enough resources. He said, and I'm going to read this quote out, there is actually a really big question the nation needs to ask itself, which is that you wouldn't send the whole of your army out at once. You have spare capacity in case there's a crisis. Yet every single day we send our whole NHS army out into the field and there is no redundancy. We run the NHS incredibly tight. That means there isn't the resilience when a crisis comes. That would require a materially huge increase in that already very, very large NHS budget. But other countries choose to spend a higher proportion of GDP on healthcare. It means they are better able to respond. Now, that sounds to me like a Tory saying that the way the Tories have run the NHS has been a terrible idea, but also at the same time blaming voters for voting in the governments that brought in all the cuts. Does he have a point? Is this somehow all our fault, or is he gaslighting us?
Well, I don't think it's the fault of voters, but I definitely think that this is one of the issues that has repeatedly come up in the last few weeks at the start of the COVID inquiry. You've heard from people like the BMA, the Doctors Union, from the TUC, the trade union umbrella body. They're all raising questions about how our hospitals did not have enough investment put in them in the years ahead of COVID, how nursing staff, we had shortages of nurses. If you look at the moment, they've got massive vacancies across the NHS and the government still hasn't come up with a proper workforce plan about how you're going to get the doctors and nurses that we need to staff the NHS in the years to come. And I think that is going to end up being one of the big themes of this first bit of the pandemic was how on earth did our hospitals not have enough resources so that the pandemic hit, they just really struggled and kind of fell apart.
Yeah, it's not been Britain's finest moment, although of course it was amazing heroism by so many people on the NHS frontline at the time, and without whom we'd all be doing so much worse than we currently are. So at least they're picking over the bones of it, but I'm not sure we're going to get very far with Matt Hancock's evidence, or indeed any of those who were in government before or during what was going on. We're going to have to see Boris Johnson at that inquiry, aren't we? We're going to have to see him go through all the sorry and the waffle and the blaming. Do we have to?
Well, I think it's good if politicians come up and answer questions. We know that the question has been quite robust in places, that I think it is right that all politicians who are involved in those important decisions come before the pandemic and explain what they're doing. You know, later this week that Nicola Sturgeon on Thursday is going to be before the pandemic talking about the preparations that were made in Scotland, that I think you are going to see a steady stream of more and more politicians coming before the inquiry before it is over, and we've got a long, long way still to go.
Yeah, I mean, there is a bit of me that really wants to see Boris Johnson questioned by a couple of barristers, and I'm looking forward to that. But at the same time, I don't. I'm kind of in despair even before we start, because I know how it's going to go. But we'll have to wait and see, won't we? Thank you for that, John. Do let us know in the comments what your experiences were of the COVID inquiry, of the COVID pandemic rather. How you feel the inquiry is going. Is it answering your questions as to what went wrong and how it went wrong? Or do you already know? Do we all already know in advance what went wrong, which was people who are in charge pretty much?